just keep trying to build a little better each day, then you're not going to end up in a situation wondering what you did with your life because you just went out and chased after what society thought you needed to know. Just put others first. You'll do fine then, and it'll bring, I guarantee you, it'll bring you a love affair with our Constitution and our country.
Thank you, General. We've had a number of great questions from our students and the Hacking Events support team. So I'm going to start with a student question. This is from Valerie Rincon, who was a star student in the class last year, now one of our lead teaching assistants. And her question is this. She said, you once stated, and she quotes you as, our strength as a nation is inextricably linked to the strength of our unique and comprehensive system of alliances and partnerships. According to Val, this seems more important than ever with the return of great power competition. So what do you believe are the most pressing challenges we face, and how would you best leverage U.S. partnerships and alliances to counteract these challenges?
Yeah, I could not more strongly agree with putting the question up first. Valerie, in all my time, like I mentioned, that I fought, I was never in an all-American formation. When I was the commander of United States Central Command, I had 72 nations represented on my staff. That's leadership. And why do I emphasize this? Because the three things I learned about when you are in a jam is allies, allies, and allies. The greatest generation came home from World War II. They were so underweight when they were drafted into the Army in World War II that over 20% of them had to be fattened up just to be trained. They'd been through a terrible depression. They'd lost hundreds of thousands of their buddies. Tens of millions worldwide had died, mostly innocent civilians, by the way. And they said, it's a crummy world, whether we like it or not. And what did the greatest generation do? Why was, when a young grad student named Henry Kissinger knocked on retired President Truman's door, why was he told what he was proudest of? Truman said was that we welcomed our enemies back into the community of nations. What did they do about this? First of all, they used the United Nations as a place to come together and talk about things. It was never meant to solve all the problems. They started with Bretton Woods in 1943-44. Never again were we going to leave desperate people without some hope. And what you and I know is the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, all these things that say, if you're feeling hopeless about creating wealth in your country, about having jobs, you don't have to turn to a fascist named Mussolini. You can turn to a lender of last resort. They put together the Marshall Plan, where we went to our hated enemies, vicious enemies after that war. And 3 years later, we were helping them get their economies going again. And then it took a foreigner to tell me this. I was having dinner one day in the backyard of the Australian ambassador's house to Washington, D.C. And he said, and then the Americans after World War II made the single most self-sacrificial pledge in world history. I think I know American history. And I said, you mean the Marshall Plan? He said, no. He said, that just shows the generosity of Americans. He said, by the way, a lot of your students aren't even taught that anymore. I have to teach that to them here in Washington, D.C. And he said, no, it wasn't that. He said, after World War II, you could have said to Europe, that's twice in 25 years you dragged us into your silly, stupid wars. We're going with Asia, with Latin America, with Africa. We're through with you. You're on your own with the Soviet Army. We're through. He said, instead, here's what you did. You pledged 100 million dead Americans in a nuclear war and sent your army to join the rest of ours that are all, we've been bombed flat. We couldn't have defended ourselves without you. And he said that was the single most self-sacrificial pledge. We're going to have to look back at this. Take a look at what happened after 9/11. America's attack and NATO that we set up to protect Europe. And the first time NATO goes to war is when the United States is attacked and they go into Afghanistan alongside it. Take a look at COVID. How are we going to address COVID in the long term if we don't, this thing doesn't know borders. We're going to have allies. So we're going to have to sell the American people on the fact that the reason we became such a prosperous nation is because we were able to set a global standard that allowed us, when Ebola River virus broke out, immediately the Americans led the way in. When ISIS came out of the desert in 2014, there's now 70 odd nations fighting ISIS under American leadership. One lesson you'll learn: we're not doing it right now, let's be honest about COVID. And on international things like this, crises like this, if the Americans don't lead, not very much happens. Valerie, you have got to stay, Val, consistent with it. Do not ever doubt your instinct right now. And I can go on for the next 5 hours giving you examples of why allies are the only way you're going to keep this experiment alive.
Thank you, General. General, I think everyone, certainly in our class and dialed in this evening, believes in this great experiment we call democracy, as you often refer to it. But this is a question from Dylan Junkin from Election Watch. He asks, how should the United States respond to authoritarian states who view the pillars of democracy as weaknesses to exploit?
Yeah, well, especially with the new technology, we recognize that there are people now with capabilities to intrude on our processes and our elections that we've never had before. But I'm a pretty strong believer that that technology can solve problems like this. They can highlight problems like this. It is hard when the adversaries are bouncing robot sent messages through 5 different servers, so you don't know where they're coming from and all. But I think with 5G, I think there's a way to deal with this where we've just got to stay ahead on the technology. A lot's going to be riding on you young folks' young shoulders here to make certain that the authoritarians do not get out in front on the technology. I mean, there's a reason right now as we sit here, that the young people in Hong Kong, that the people of Taiwan do not want to be part of China. And it's not because somebody in Washington, D.C. is accusing them of something. It's because of the reality. The authoritarians will have capabilities that they've never enjoyed before, that a guy like Hitler would have loved to have. But what we have to do is make sure that our technology is enabling the human interface. And I would say those words again, enabling the human interface, so that we do not become spectators to the technology, but we stay in a controlling, advocating, and enabling role. While the technology enables us, we enable it to be used for the right reasons. But it's going to be a challenge. It'll be largely fought out on the technical ground, I think. But we also have to have leaders who can pull people together on democracy's basic principles. And there, I think we better look at our education, and are we really teaching civics in a way that is relevant to young people today? And I'm not certain we are. Let me just stop there because I want to be able to take more. Does that answer your question, Dylan, or do you want to come back at me on that one?
I got a chat message that out of the park, General, as your answers tend to be. General, we have a big support team that supports our students, military mentors, advisors, industry mentors. So this is a question that comes from Colonel Leo Liebreich, who you know is a Hoover National Security Affairs Fellow, a brand new colonel, I might add. And his question is this: in your book, you state that in international affairs, he's quoting you, we have often had to choose between the lesser of 2 evils, and that sometimes it's necessary to strike the best balance possible between idealism and pragmatism. And Leo asks, how do you strike this difficult balance between idealism and pragmatism, and what guides you in making such decisions?
Yeah, you know, this is always a tough one. And Leo, congratulations on getting promoted. Colonel Feller, it's not like when you and I made it, they're promoting everybody nowadays. You know, if Leo made it, for God's sakes, you know, I mean, can you believe it? I think that you have to recognize that throughout our history, to keep this experiment alive, we've had to go at times with some pretty unsavory dudes. I mean, there's no way FDR, one of our most progressive presidents, and a personal hero of mine, there's no way he said, oh, good, I get to work with Joe Stalin this week. That's not the way it happened, you know what I mean? He had to work with Joseph Stalin, who'd murdered millions of his own countrymen, and was just a terrible, loathsome human being. But we had to do it. Nowadays, what we have to do is we have to look at what is the threat. I'll give you an example. There was a while there back in the 1960s when Korea was a dictatorship. There's no way, no two ways about it. But they never tried to export the dictatorship, and we just kept working with Korea, kept working with them. Our military was there. Our military is unapologetic about civilian control of our military. They're unapologetic about democratic principles. And we just kept working with them, even though some people said we shouldn't be helping this dictatorship. Look at them today, a vibrant democracy. They made it through. There are times we forget that some of the nations we work with, they just came out from underneath colonialism 1 or 2 generations ago. They don't have 600 years of the Magna Carta traditions. And so, first of all, be a little humble. We were really, really lucky, and we still don't have it right. As we all know right now, not one of us would argue that America has reached some nirvana of perfection. So keep a little humility, be willing to work with others, never apologize for what we believe in. Always we're trying to do better, but at the same time, America needs to survive. And therein, when the person at the top says, we've got to work with somebody like this, make sure the Congress is watching it and keeping a good close eye on it, have good arguments about it. But there are times that you're simply going to have to learn that you don't get the choice between a morally perfect and a morally bad government. Oftentimes, people are caught in mid-stride somewhere in there, and you've got to deal with it. But it doesn't mean you ever surrender your ideas either. And I was never apologetic or half-stepping when I walked into people's offices overseas, even if they were called Your Majesty or Mr. Prime Minister or Mr. President or anything else. You know, we're the Americans, and we believe in the dignity of the individual and the human rights. And we just keep representing it. But the best thing you can do is have a country that demonstrates it. And there, we need to do some work here at home right now.
General, it was always a privilege even to be at the end of the table in some of those meetings when you represented us so well. General, we have time for maybe a couple more here, and I'm going to shift to, well, let me, a little background. Hacking for Defense, it was started at Stanford, Steve Blank, Pete Newell, and I back in 2016 with a whole lot of help. And it has since scaled to over 40 universities. And one of the organizations that helps scale this is the Common Mission Project. And this question is from the director of the Common Mission Project, Alex Gallo, an infantry officer and combat vet. His question is this: the lean methodology used in H4D, Hacking for Defense, is a way to solve challenging defense and national security problems, but it's also an approach to solve civic and social challenges. What are some of the priority areas beyond defense would you recommend that Hacking for Defense or the Hacking for methodology is applied to and uses this problem-solving approach to address?
Yeah, I'll tell you one right at the top of my list, and it's one that you weren't personally involved in this part, Joe, but when we were given the mission to protect the midterm election a year and a half ago, we need to have ways of ensuring that when we vote, those votes are counted, those votes are not compromised, that we can have confidence in how we are doing this in this country. Because right now we know that in many ways, the authoritarians just want everyone to doubt that we know what we're doing, that we can run a fair election. They don't care, frankly, I don't think, who wins. They just want to make certain that none of us believe in our processes, in our systems, that democracy cannot work. So as we look at this, how do you enable the human interface between that machine, computer, if they're voting from home or whatever, and the people doing the counting and displaying that data, that it not be compromised, manipulated, or anything like that? I would put that one right up at the very top. That's as important to me as defense against enemy missiles. Because if we ever lose the sense that we trust the results of our elections, then everything that follows is subject to questioning and a loss of confidence. I can go on with some others too, but that's the one that I would throw out right away to say, we need this, and it's not going to be something that the military